Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's live event with National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nikki LaFoyle back to answer all of your sewing questions. So thanks for being here, Nikki.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I just want to remind everyone that you can ask your questions to Nikki by typing them into the chat box. I believe it's the larger of the chat boxes. I want to make sure that you are putting it into that because we'll actually see that one live. The smaller little chat box does go to our customer service department, and we do answer those. We just won't see them right now. So be sure you're putting them in the right chat box. We have a couple that have already come in. So the first one here is it easier creating a slope via draping or exact body measurements?
So creating a slope, the only slope that comes to mind for that terminology is a shoulder slope. So I don't know if that's exactly what they mean, but for me, draping is like a whole other skill set, and I've never really, I've played around with it before, but I like to use exact body measurements when I'm, drafting patterns and doing alterations and things. It's easier for me, and I don't have a dress form. So if you're doing draping, you kind of need a dress form to be able to pin your fabric up and see where all of the drapes will lay on the form. So for me, it's always exact body measurements. But if you have dipped your feet into draping and that feels easier for you, maybe I feel like that's kind of a personal preference thing.
Perfect. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to assuming that maybe this is a typo and that maybe they meant sloper. And does that change your answer? I don't know. I figured I'd ask it both ways.
Yeah. So a sloper, for anybody who doesn't know, a sloper is just like your basic blocks of a basic pattern that you can then use to alter into whatever different design styles you want. So the basic block pattern sloper, again, I think I would use exact body measurements because then you can get a very precise, precise curves and lines fit, exactly to your body so that when you then transfer that pattern into making other designs, you're starting from a place that is exact for your body. So exact measurements and, drawing your lines with a ruler, a French curve or a straight ruler on pattern paper it's always, easier for me to visualize and to get down on paper.
Perfect. Awesome. All right, next one here. Alil says, do you have a simple way to measure and sew a perfect armhole and sleeve?
The perfect armhole and sleeve. That's the
Does
white
that
brown.
exist?
It's tough. It can be really tough. But so I don't know that I would be able to articulate like an exact technique, but I do have a couple of tips. So for a good armhole and sleeve fit joined together, if you're using a commercial pattern that you bought from the store, from some of the big pattern companies, a lot of times they add in way too much ease in the sleeve cap. So that's a good starting point, is taking out some of that ease, because when you have too much fabric in the sleeve cap, it's hard to ease all of that into the armhole. So you'll get either tucks in your seam or puckers or just like a big puffy sleeve, which maybe is the look you're going for, but if it's not, you can just take some of that ease out. So I'll try and show with my hands here how to do that. So to remove ease from a sleeve cap, you can take the pattern, trace a copy of it first, because you always want to preserve the original. Trace a copy, make a slash at the bicep line, which is just like an inch or so below the edge where your sleeve cap begins. So about an inch below that is your bicep line. So draw a line there and draw a line down the center of the pattern as well to intersect with that bicep line, and just cut down to, let's see, what way would you cut to pivot? Yeah, you would cut down from the sleeve cap down to that bicep line and cut from the edges into the bicep line and just kind of overlap that sleeve cap to just take some of that ease out of that line. And then, the join where you're overlapping is going to be, the line isn't going to be right. So you're going to have to then true that line. And truing the line just means to smooth it into the basic shape that it was to begin with. So you just kind of smooth that out into a nice curve. And you'll have to true the sleeve seam as well, just bring it back into a straight line. So yeah, taking out some ease from the sleeve cap. A lot of times pattern companies will put 1 to 2 inches of ease into that sleeve cap, which you don't need more than like 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch. If you're sewing with a knit fabric, you really don't need any ease because the knit fabric will stretch and ease itself in just from the construction of the fabric itself. So that's a good place to start. And for inserting sleeves into an armhole, I actually really like the method where you don't sew the side seam and the sleeve seam first. So if you sew the side seam and the sleeve seam, then you'd be stitching the armhole in the round. So you've got like a circular seam that you're doing and you're trying to fit it on your machine bed and fiddle around with it. But if you leave that flat, you leave your the sleeve seam unstitched, so the sleeve is flat. You leave the side seams of the shirt unstitched, so that shirt is essentially flat, and you just insert your sleeve into your armhole that way. Then you can stitch your sleeve seam, pivot at the armhole, and stitch the side seam all in one. So it kind of saves you a step. And I feel like it's easier to insert because it's, you've got more room to move things around and you're not trying to work in this tiny little hole. So
yeah. I have so many follow-up questions for you. You know this. So for one, I have to say the very first time I ever made a shirt, I'm pretty sure I never knew that you could do the sleeve insert that way. Like you said, sewing from here all the way down, all in one long seam. I always thought you have to set in a sleeve. That's just how it is. So yeah, I think when I discovered that was an awesome aha moment. But a couple things. So when you're removing ease from a sleeve cap, because I know we have a video on National Sewing Circle. Jill Case did the video for us, but she has a little bit of a different technique in doing it. So I wanted your thoughts on sort of how she did it, because she actually more so measured herself to know how big the arm's eye opening was going to be, measured with a flexible measuring tape the top of the actual pattern piece, and then redrew the line that way. So there was no cutting or slashing. So if you had to pick which one you thought was easier for the first time ever doing this alteration, which one would you pick?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. Jill's way is probably easier for someone who is not familiar with the slash method. That's how I learned how to do pattern alteration. So I'm very comfortable with that. But yeah, to just measure the armhole opening that you're putting that sleeve cap into and just kind of redrawing that curve. You don't have to do any truing, and it's a little fewer steps, and you get a nice precise sleeve cap. So yeah, that's a really good method as well. I would go with that for beginner pattern alteration, and I might even try it too. That actually sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah. Well, perfect. So now you have multiple ways. Try them both. See which one works best for you. Next follow-up question, of course, is so no matter what method you're doing, you are sort of redrawing that line. It's obviously getting smaller as the whole point of removing some ease. So if I'm using a commercial pattern and I've got my big circles and small circles and notches and double notches, and what happens to all of those when I make my pattern different?
Yeah, so you can try to transfer those markings if you want to have those markings. But if you're taking all of the ease out of the sleeve cap, you don't actually even need those markings, because those markings are so that your ease is evenly distributed throughout the cap. So if you don't have any ease, you don't have any extra fabric to ease in, you don't really need those. But if you still have some ease and you want to make sure it's evenly distributed, you can, sort of move those. So if you have your initial sleeve cap and your sleeve cap is, your redrawn sleeve cap is kind of, it brings it down. You can bring those markings just down on, just kind of transfer them down to your new line. You can even, if you want to get real precise about it, measure the distance from the edge of the seam to the marking and figure out like what percentage of the sleeve cap those markings take up and transfer them to your new line.
Mhm.
But also, you don't really need to get that scientific about it. If it's in the general vicinity of where those markings were initially, you're going to get that ease evenly distributed. You just want to have it, generally distributed on the top of the sleeve cap.
Yeah. I think even when I have a pattern that I haven't made any alteration to, it's like a gentle guideline. Like I'm not sure that I'm perfectly between, or lining up those notches and marks, but as long as it's all distributed to where there is no
No
pleats or
puckers.
puckers or
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah,
Just
it's
a
just a
it's a
suggestion.
suggestion. Yeah,
Yeah.
like all right. Christy says, I'm trying to sew seams of leotard using 4-way lycra and a serger 4-thread, 2 cotton, and 2 woolly nylon, and I just can't get the tension right. What tension setting would you suggest?
So that's an awesome project. So for sergers, I have a serger. It's still in the box in my closet. So I'm
Mine too.
not I'm not super familiar with the serger and serger settings. So I probably can't be too helpful, but here's what I would say. Just something to try, perhaps. If the tension settings are, if you can't quite get the tension right, maybe try using all 4 threads of the same fiber content. Because sometimes if you're using different fiber contents, I mean, for me, in my experience using just a regular sewing machine, if you use a different weight of thread in the bobbin versus the needle thread, it can throw off your tension a little bit, and you have to make adjustments to make up for that. So it stands to reason that maybe the same thing might be happening on a serger, but
Mhm.
again, I'm just kind of pulling that out of left field because it seems like it seems like it makes sense, but I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, Christy.
I say we
Uh,
all have our things that we like and don't like. I also have a serger, also in a box in the closet, because it came threaded and then it got unthreaded, and I haven't attempted to put it back together. But we'll say if you want more information on sergers, we have a lot of videos, classes on National Sewing Circle. So several full length classes, making friends with your sergers, then making friends with your serger beyond the basics. So once you get just through the basics of it, then you can go into making some more complicated or difficult projects, different stitches, different finishing techniques. So definitely plenty of information on sergers available there. Our next question here is from Angela, and so it's about sleeves, and I know we did talk about sleeves a lot already, but this is specifically in putting sleeves in a jacket. So sort of following up on the tips you already gave us, anything you would change or do differently given, thicker jacket fabric, a lining, things that go with a jacket versus a shirt?
yeah. So with a jacket, the fit is a little bit different because you want a jacket to have enough room in the shoulders to put it on over your regular clothes. So a shirt, I like to sit, close to my shoulders. So I don't like a whole lot of extra ease in my sleeves. But with a jacket, you might be okay with that. And so the jacket material also makes a difference because with like, oh, if you're making a wool jacket or like a wool blazer, wool is a little bit easier to maneuver, to ease in, especially if you're using a little bit of steam. You can kind of mold that wool. So you don't need a lot of ease in that. But if you're using a material that's a little bit stiffer, you might need that ease. to get that sleeve cap in properly. And you might be okay with having a little bit more ease to fit that, to fit that sleeve over your, if you live somewhere like me in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you're wearing a sweater and another sweater under your jacket, you might want to have that extra room in your sleeve. But the same process applies. And I would say even more so, you would not want to stitch that in the round, because if you're using a fabric that is, heavy or stiff, it's going to be hard to maneuver in a little arm's eye. So leaving that flat is, extra beneficial in that sense.
Yeah. My favorite part about sewing a jacket versus sewing a shirt is that you get to line it and you don't have to worry about doing like a flat felled seam finish in the arm. But we don't need jackets in Texas, so I haven't made one in a long time. So, all right, next one here. Why, when I use my walking foot, does the fabric bunch up? I know the foot is on correctly, otherwise it wouldn't work at all, right? But now I just end up ripping out all of my bunched up fabric and thread.
So when the walking foot is on, the fabric bunches up. So if you're sure the foot is on correctly, I would make sure your feed dogs are up properly. Try it on some different fabric types. Maybe, sometimes if you're using a lighter weight slinky fabric, it might need a little extra stabilization under it, especially at the beginning of a seam. No matter what, if you're using even a nice stiff fabric, sometimes at the beginning of the seam, if you try to start at the very beginning, it gets bunched up. So try starting a little bit in from the end of the fabric, maybe. Make sure your needle is threaded correctly. You're hitting all the right tension points on your machine when you're threading your needle, and make sure your bobbin is wound correctly and inserted correctly. All of these things can affect, everything about the performance of your machine. Make sure that you're using a fresh needle. Just go ahead and throw a fresh needle on there. That helps everything work better. I've never encountered that problem, but I don't usually use a actual walking foot. I have the integrated dual feed foot on my FOF Passport 2.0, which is just a little thing that you pull down and clip under the foot, so that acts as a walking foot. I've not had that experience. Ashley, have you?
No, and when I read this question, I thought of something it's going to sound super weird, kind of, but so I also have a FOF that I've used too, which has the integrated dual feed, and then I don't have a walking foot on my big giant Viking machine that I'm using now, because it has I forget the acronym it has, but it has a different feed system. But I had a very old Brother machine, and on that Brother machine, it had a walking foot that was like this big. This thing was the clodhopper of a walking foot, right? But then what looks very, very similar to a walking foot, same size, same everything, different teeth on it, is a ruffler foot. They literally look the same. So it's going to sound weird, but make sure it is a walking foot that you're using, because the only difference is that rather than the feed dogs, from the bottom pulling and the walking foot just clamping down on it, the ruffler does that, but then just goes ding, ding, right, and it brings it in. So if it is, say, bunching rather uniformly, then make sure that it's not a bunching problem. But yeah, it could just be. And like I said, I've seen them sitting next to each other. Maybe there's a slight difference in size, but they look so similar that you could have just grabbed the wrong one. Especially if it's a new to you machine, but maybe you're borrowing it from someone. You got it secondhand. You and I both have bags of accessory presser feet, right? So if you just make sure. So I know it sounds weird, but we'll go with that.
That sounds like something I would do if I was upstairs and hadn't had my coffee yet, or if it's late at night and the lighting is bad in my sewing room, I grab the wrong foot. That sounds like it's possible for sure.
So, all right, another one here. Lisa wants to know what would be a good suggestion for an inexpensive embroidery machine for a very beginner, very being all caps. very beginner.
Very. So embroidery machines. I haven't looked at prices of embroidery machines in a while, and actually, I think some brands or some manufacturers don't even have the prices on their website, which is annoying to me.
Mhm.
You have to go to a dealer to look at it. Um, but I think the last time I checked, some inexpensive, reasonably priced embroidery machines. Um, I mean, I think all companies kind of have a range. Um, but I want to say FOF has some good lower priced embroidery machines that are still great and function great. When I worked for Sew News and Creative Machine Embroidery magazines, we had a whole bunch of machines in our sewing room. And when I had to embroider something, I always went to the FOF just because I liked how it worked. Um, so you can check there. I know, Bernina is one that's good for embroidery machines. They might be a little higher end if I remember correctly. Um, but yeah, I mean, I I'm partial to FOF. So I mean, what's the best sewing machine? It is very personal. It depends on what you like, what you're comfortable with, what your experience has been. Um, but if you can, it's hard now to go anywhere to test drive. I was gonna say go test drive an embroidery machine, but you
Yeah,
maybe might not be able to. So reading reviews is another good way to get a feel for what's a good machine for a beginner.
yeah.
But it takes quite a bit of research.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, you've mentioned you're partial to FOF, so that's sort of the first one that you think of. Um, I'm not. I don't necessarily always have a machine preference, but because I've used a bunch of different brands of machines, but I do personally have a Viking embroidery machine, and it's funny because we worked at the same office, and I never picked the FOF one. There was a baby lock one over in the corner, and that's what I always went to because it was like this big giant one, and I just thought it was cool to use that one because it looked so fancy. So it's like
Yeah,
there's little, preferences of there. But then also, I think it's going to come down to what kind of embroidery you plan to do. So, basic embroidery where you're not going to design any of your own designs. You want what's already loaded on the machine, or you want to, purchase one online, download it onto a USB and plug it into the machine. Like that's a pretty basic embroidery machine versus, I mean, Brother has embroidery machines now that you can place an image underneath the presser, but it scans it. It becomes, what I mean? Like, so you can get very, very complex with the embroidery machine. So you need to decide what kind of embroidery you're going to do. And I think that can also help narrow down uh,
yeah,
price range for sure.
yeah, definitely.
So, all right, Jan wants to know, do I really need a serger? What can it do for me that a sewing machine cannot?
So yeah, I mean, from what Ashley and I just said, both of our sergers are in the closet.
Yeah.
So you don't need a serger. People like having sergers because they sew faster, and it's good for you can sew seams and finish the seam at the same time. So if you have a sewing business or something and you're sewing something that um, is easy to do on a serger, you can just go through and just like knock it out.
Mhm.
It's good for that. If you would rather do anything else other than finish your seams, maybe a serger is good for you. I don't mind going back and just taking a zigzag stitch to finish my seam allowances. I don't
Mhm.
mind that. But yeah, a serger is just it's faster. It's nice that it overcasts the edge of your seam allowances for you. Um, but no, you don't need one.
Yeah.
And I've gotten by my whole sewing career without using one. I've dabbled here and there. I kind of generally kind of know how to use one. And maybe I'll bust mine out of the closet and figure it out. But yeah, the sewing machine has always done everything that I need it to do. And I can crank the speed up on this guy and really fly and
Yeah.
just go back and finish my seam allowances after. It's another step, but I don't
Yeah.
mind it.
I would say the only thing that it physically can do, right, that the machine can't, is that it can cut your fabric. as you're sewing, right? So it has a
Right.
little knife on it. But if you already, have sewn something with the seam allowance that you want to have it have, and then you can finish it that way. But yeah, I'm like you. I think I just want to get to the project and make the project and then be done with it. And I think I would spend more time trying to learn how to use and thread my serger. I would have just been able to finish it already on my sewing machine. So
Right.
yeah.
Yep.
Next question here, Carissa wants to know, what are your favorite tips for beginner sewers?
Ooh, my favorite tips. So for a beginner sewer, I would say make sure you're using the right kind of fabric for your project. I'd say start with a nice stable fabric like a quilting cotton. Don't jump right into trying to sew knits because they come with some more considerations that you've got to think about that are better. It's best if you build up to that. Because it can be a little bit frustrating if you don't have the tools or the skills to know how to deal with that. So a nice stable cotton fabric is good to start with. But also make sure that you don't have like a t-shirt pattern that needs to stretch, and you get quilting cotton fabric for that, because that's not going to work out, because patterns for knit garments are a lot different than patterns for woven garments. Knit garments don't need openings, they don't need zippers or buttons. Knit garments you pull over your head and the knit fabric stretches where it needs to, whereas woven garments will need fasteners to get on and off. So work with a good easy fabric to begin with to build your skills. Start with simple projects, start with straight lines. That's a good way to build up and get comfortable with a sewing machine. Choose cute fabric. That always makes it more fun, and you're less likely to get frustrated and quit if you have a super cute fabric and you really want to see the project at the end. It just makes everything more fun. Um, Make sure you use a sharp needle. That's a big one for me, because tension problems can arise from a dull needle. And when you're a beginner sewer and you're not super comfortable with or familiar with all of the inner mechanisms of the sewing machine and how it works, if you start having tension issues, it can get really frustrating really fast. So make sure you're changing out your needle for every about 6 hours of sewing you have on that needle. And if you do get tension issues, change your needle first of all. But if you do need to touch the tension dial, just make small adjustments at a time. Don't jump from 4 to 6. Go from 4 to 4.5 and test, and then go from 4.5 to 5 and test. Just minor adjustments to the needle tension might be all you need. And let's see. Use a lot of pins. Some people don't like using pins. I know
I
Ellen
love
March
pins.
never.
I'm an avid overpinner.
Me too. And even at this stage of my sewing, it's really helpful, so that you're not trying to, mess with it as it's going under the presser foot to make sure everything is lined up right. Just pin it while it's flat and you can control it and then get it under the presser foot. And I like to pin, speaking of pinning, I like to pin like this. Instead of pinning so that your pin head sticks up like that, I like to pin like this, perpendicular to my seam, so that then when it's going under my presser foot, I can just pull it out toward me. And pinning perpendicular to your seam, it holds a little bit more of that fabric together instead of going,
Yeah. So you're parallel. You're parallel to
parallel.
the seam. I am perpendicular to the seam. I am the way that you showed not to do it, but I like to do it that way. because I'm right-handed. So like as I'm sewing, I can just pull that. Yep,
Mhm.
yep. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a personal preference thing as well. It's easier for me. It seems to hold more fabric together.
Mhm.
But again, you try it either way, see what you
Yeah,
like, see what works for you. And so for beginners, like beginner tools, let me talk about that for a quick second.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Also, I mean, not just for beginners, but for me, it was a game changer. Just a wrist pin cushion. I made this one.
And
You
I
can
have
find
one that looks
the
just like it.
product matching.
Hmm.
Because I would always forget my pin cushion halfway across the room, and it's just so easy and
Yeah,
simple, and it comes with you. Just be careful that if you're sewing and you're taking out your pins and you're going to put it in your pin cushion. I've definitely drawn blood before because I missed the pin cushion and just jabbed myself in the arm.
just
Something to
going too
watch.
fast. Yeah. So, but though
Um,
we do have a video, you did a step-by-step tutorial for us on obviously National Sewing Circle for making that exact pin cushion. So if you want to make one, check that out for sure.
yes, and last tip, and then we can move on. But for beginner sewers, I could talk all day long. For beginner sewers, it can be kind of overwhelming the amount of supplies there are in Joann Fabrics or your whatever fabric store or supply store you go to. There's aisles and aisles of different kinds of needles and different kinds of threads and fiber contents and all of this. Just get a universal needle. It's going to be fine. It for 99% of the stuff you do, especially when you're starting out. Universal needle in a size 70-10 or 80-12. That's a good mid-range size gauge of needle. And the universal needle, like it says, universal. You can use it for pretty much anything.
Yeah.
It's when you start using different fabrics um, that you might want to start thinking about different needles. And for thread, all purpose thread, it's going to be fine. Again, pretty intuitive, the name all purpose. You can use it for 99% of things. All purpose thread is a polyester core cotton wrapped thread. So it has, it's a good all purpose thread. Either all purpose or 100% polyester thread is another good one to use. Works
Mhm.
for pretty much anything. So if you're getting overwhelmed by everything out there, just universal needle, all purpose thread, and read your machine manual, make sure you're threading it correctly, and start having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing with the universal needle, I always get the value pack. It's got like 70, 80, 90. Those are like the three main sizes. So same thing. You can use it on everything. And then, if for some reason you're like, oh, I think this fabric I'm using, or I'm using multiple layers, so it's a little bit thicker, put on the next needle size up too. Another thing I want to talk about with pins real quick, because I do have you made me, we have matching wrist pin cushions. But lately my sewing has been a lot of one-handed sewing while holding a 2-month-old. So I love my magnetic one, because as I'm sewing, I just pull them out and just like drop it near the pin cushion, and it just goes right there too. So if you also have one-handed sewing needs, I recommend magnetic pin cushions as well. And then, of course, since we're talking beginner sewing, and you mentioned, picking out fun fabric is a great thing to sort of help you get motivated to finish a project, but also knowing what you're going to do with that project or who's going to get it. So, which reminded me to talk about our free download that we have. That is in the banner either below or above the video you're watching right now. And that is our calendar for sewing from the comfort of your home. So it kind of plans out a week for you. Starts on Monday, so you can download it now, print it out, and get ready on Monday. But you plan and prep on Monday. You pick a project that you want to make, and you decide you're going to either make this project start to finish over a week, or maybe it's your motivation to finish up a project that you have stored away for a while and need to get back to. But then you're going to tackle it on Tuesday and work on it on Wednesday, so you can see where we're going with this calendar. And then on Thursday, we called it Thoughtful Thursday. So that's the day where you're going to decide who gets the project, or what you're going to use it for. And again, that's going to, I think, give you the motivation to finish that project. And then, of course, there's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and all other fun things on that calendar. So be sure to download it and check it out. And we have a follow-up here from Christy. So she says, thank you so much for your serger threading tips. I'm determined to get use of my serger, even when it takes me 2 hours to figure the stitch out. So she said she'll take your advice. But another thing I wanted to throw out, I had to search it real quick while you were talking because I knew I had seen it, but I couldn't remember what brand. But Baby Lock has the air thread serger. So you push the button and a jet air threads it for you. So yeah,
Nice.
that'd probably be the one I would pick if I had to go get my own.
Nice.
All right. Next question here. Are there any hacks to help me sew in a straight line? I'm a beginner at the sewing thing.
Ooh, yes. Well, welcome to the sewing world. Thank you for tuning in. I hope I can help. So sewing in a straight line, you want to start with cutting a straight line, because to sew a straight line, you are, measuring from the edge of your fabric to the needle. So to get a straight line there, you want to have a straight line at the edge. So use a good ruler. I bought an OmniGrid ruler that has like that friction back type thing. Yes, that one. That's the exact one that I bought, and I really like it. Yes, it's nice and thick so that my rotary cutter doesn't jump up onto it and nick the edge like my cheap rulers I've been using forever. And it has, the back isn't slick. It's not sticky, but it's just not slick. It has some stuff on the back that gives you some friction to grab your fabric. And I like to use a rotary cutter. It gives you a nice straight line without, your scissors kind of pull up on the fabric to get underneath it. And between the tip of the scissor cut to the next cut, you can kind of get off sometimes. Or if you don't have a rotary cutter or are scared of using one, don't want to use one against your ruler, when you're making a mark against your ruler on your fabric, make sure you're holding your ruler down so that you get a nice straight line and get as close to the ruler as you can with your marking utensil. I like marking pens because they have a fine tip to get really close to your ruler. But if you have like a chalk pencil or something, make sure you have a sharp tip to get close to your ruler and mark your nice straight line to cut either with scissors or a rotary cutter. So straight line on the edge of your fabric. Also, you can my FOF has like a little ruler on the machine bed so that I can measure 3/8 inch, half inch, 5/8 inch, all the way up to like 2 inches or more, so that I get an exact seam allowance. If yours doesn't have that, or if you want something more visual, you can put a piece of tape on your machine bed, measuring from your ruler to the edge of the tape, whatever seam allowance you decide you want to use. Excuse me. And line up the edge of your fabric with the edge of that tape, and that's a good bold visual for you to align that edge with, to make sure you're getting a nice even seam allowance all the way down. Also, don't focus on don't look at the needle. Look at the fabric in front of the needle, the fabric that's sliding under the presser foot. Because, if your fabric gets a little bit tilted, and you're looking at the needle, you're not going to notice that, you're going to get crooked in a second until it's there, and then it's kind of almost too late to fix. So keep your eye on, your fabric as it's like right here. Don't stare at the needle. I know it's exciting to watch it lay that stitch down, but you want to focus on, what's coming so that you can control it.
Yeah. It's like when you're learning to drive a car and they always said, don't look at the road right in front, look out. It's kind of the opposite of that. You're not obviously looking behind the needle, but so I was gathering up all my little things here while you're talking. So, because you were mentioning your ruler, so I'm holding up a smaller version to show, because you did mention the thickness, and yeah, there's definitely a difference between, I'm going to call these all quilting rulers because you'll probably find them in the quilting section of the store versus, say, the pattern drafting if they have it, separated between sewing and quilting. And then the stuff on the back, it's the lines themselves. So there's not actually, I don't want anyone listening to think that there's like physically something sticky on the back of the ruler, because it's not that at all. It's all the lines, all the green It's just like that. If you think put on your bathtub so you don't fall in the shower, it's like that kind of stuff. So it doesn't slip. And then with the straight lines, because you're talking about the lines on your machine, and all the machines I'd ever used in the past only had those lines on the throat plate, which is really beneficial when, lining up your seam allowances. But the Viking that I'm using now has them on the bobbin cover too, which is the first machine I've ever used that has them on there, which is super handy when you're trying to do like a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch seam allowance or something that, is not way over, and you have to line it up on this bobbin cover first. So this just came with the machine, but I bet you could probably even find bobbin covers that have those markings on them, or of course draw your own markings on there. But that's just another sort of extra little thing I like about that machine, because I got to plug mine. You get to plug Foth. So
Yeah.
Deanna does say that Foth is a solid sewing machine and she loves hers. And then she has a Janome 400 embroidery machine and loves it. So whoever was asking about embroidery machines, that could be one to look into as well. All right, our next question here. How do you feel about upcycling old clothes? It's a big trend right now. Do you have any tips when looking to upscale an old garment?
Yes, I love upcycling old clothes. It's a great way to get some bang for your buck. If you go to the thrift store and you see something that's a sweet fabric, but the cut is like super weird, just that's what's great about knowing how to sew is you can take that and make it into whatever you want. And upcycling old garments is also great because you don't need to start from scratch. It's already in the basic shapes that you want. You can just tweak here and there to make it exactly what you want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So for tips for upcycling garments, I would say, um, if you're trying to get a better fit for you, put the garment on inside out. Look at yourself in a mirror. If you have a friend to help you, that can also be helpful. But you can pin it inside out to kind of the lines that you want, and getting it off afterward is the challenge. But even if you only pin one side, or if you pin both sides to get it even, then you remove the pins from one side to take it off. Then you can measure where your seam line will be on one side and do the same thing to the other side.
Yeah.
So get a good visual of it on yourself. Also, when I'm looking to upcycle an old garment, I look at where the seams are on that garment and how I can use those seams to change the style. So using the seams that are already there, if you want to let something out, choose a seam to open up and add fabric in. And whatever you do to one side, you want to do to the others. Whether you're letting it out or taking it in, you want to distribute that evenly. So if you're letting a fabric or a garment out, let it out evenly on both sides, or take it in evenly on both sides. And if you have like a center back seam and you're taking something in a generous amount, like 2 inches or something, break that up between the side seams and the center back seam, because that will help preserve the grain of the garment, how it falls, how it fits. Just like if you're scaling something up or down, you want to do it evenly throughout the garment so that you don't get like something lopsided. If you take everything out of the center back seam, it's gonna, the front's gonna be bigger and it's gonna pull weird. So you want to take that out of several different places. So just evenly distribute that.
Absolutely. We actually have a video on National Sewing Circle with Aurora, one of our other instructors, demonstrating the whole putting it on inside out and pinching it technique. She was wearing a button down one, so a little bit easier, but yeah, taking the pins out to help you get it off would be good. What are your thoughts on, I've seen this on Pinterest before, and I know you have a daughter, so this could be fun for you, but like taking, your old shirt or something and essentially making it way smaller so it's now her shirt. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. How would you? Yeah.
Those are super cute and I love that. So yeah, you're essentially uh, using that garment as just fabric and then cutting out a smaller kid size pattern from that fabric. I've seen it where it's like a man's button down. So you would just have to center the pattern that you're laying down, center that over, the placket of the button
Mhm.
down. So, placement of the pattern on that garment would be, essential. And then you'd probably want to open a garment up. So if it's like a shirt, you'd want to open up the side seams so that you've got, one layer to cut the front of your new garment, and then you can cut the back out of the back. So kind of separating those pieces out to essentially use them as flat fabric to cut your new pattern. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
super cool.
Yeah. Perfect. All right, next question here. Dan says, do you have any issues with pinning causing fabric to shift and get out of line?
Um, Sometimes, depending on the fabric that you're using, if you're using like a kind of like a slinky, shiny knit, a lot of times you breathe on it wrong and it shifts out of line. Or if it's like a velvet or a velveteen, the nap will shift against each other. Um, and in that case, I just use a lot of pins, and you've just got to be careful and keep an eye on the edges of your fabric as you're pinning to make sure everything is staying in line. If you're having a really hard time keeping it in line, something that you can do is hand based on either side of the seam line. And that will really help lock that fabric in place. I use that sometimes if I'm sewing on velvet, which you get a lot of creeping on. So just based on either side of the seam line, it really helps hold it in.
Mhm. Yep. I know some people listening, mom, she hates basting. She'll never baste. She'll be like, I'll use a million pins before I ever baste anything. But this is another kind of weird tip with pins, but something that can happen. So I only have a little piece of quilting fabric in front of me because that's what I was doing earlier. But like how you're putting the pin in, I know we talked about you pin parallel to your seam, and that I think is going to help when you're wanting your fabric to not shift. When I am doing it and I want my pin to be, sticking out here, when I put it into the fabric first, I'm always like straight into the fabric, and then I rock the pin up, which if you have fabric that doesn't sit well against each other, as soon as you rock that pin, you're going to lift one side and push the other side down. So yeah, kind of come at it more even with the fabric. Yep,
Yeah.
yep. So rather than going in and then turning. So I hope that visual helped a little, but as soon as you do it one time with a fabric that shifts against itself, you're going to be like, oh, I know exactly what they were talking about.
Yep.
Yep.
That's a great tip too.
Perfect. All right, Vaughn says, I have never sewn on a knit fabric. What's a good project to start with?
So a good knit project, if you have a use for skirts, if you wear them or if you can gift them to someone, a knit skirt is a great place to start because it's straight lines and no closure or anything. You might need to put elastic at the top or thread elastic through a casing, but really you could make a skirt with two seams, a center back seam, and then fold the top under and stitch to create a casing, slide your casing in. You don't necessarily have to hem knit fabric because it won't ravel. I always hem everything just because that's type A personality over here. But 2 to 3 seams and you can make a skirt, and it's really easy, and you can be super like flexible with your measurements because a knit fabric is going to stretch around your body anyway. So if you take your measurements and you get, generally your general size, if it's too big for you, you can cut your elastic, smaller so that it'll gather in at the top. Or if you cut it smaller than yourself, you'll just have a form-fitting skirt.
But
So
still, it's knit fabric. It's going to work.
yeah, it'll work. Just kind of pay attention to what style you want, how much ease you want in it. And when I say ease there, it's wearing ease,
Yep.
which is just how tight you want it to fit to your body.
Right.
But yeah, that's a great, easy beginner project.
Yeah. So I think we both know I don't do a whole lot of sewing with knits either. But so I get to watch every single video that's going to go on National Science Month before it goes. That's why I have a vast library up here of all videos we have. But I've recently, it's been a little while now, it's already on the site, but you show how to make a tank top, and you are specifically showing how to bind those neck edges using fold over elastic. But it's still like every time I watch that video, I'm like, I think I could do this. Like, I think it makes me want to make a knit tank top, which I've never said I want to sew with knit before, probably in my life. So just seeing, if you're intimidated by the fabric, just watching you construct, whether it's the skirt, the shirt, you have several videos of things that you have made out of knit fabric, sort of seeing how easy it is for you to do that. You're just pinning it, you're sewing it. It looks very natural and easy. I think it's going to, help put someone else at ease too, and be like, oh, I can totally tackle that project. So if you don't want to wear a skirt, I highly recommend the tank top video, and using the fold over elastic for the neck and arms eye edges. So one of these days I'll make one and I'll show you.
Good. And one of these days I'll start quilting and I'll show you.
Perfect. There we go. See, that's what we should do. I am in tank top weather. You are in quilt weather. We should really be,
Swap.
I know. Okay. Our next one, following up on the question with the walking foot and the bunched up fabric, she says it's the bottom fabric that bunches up. I've had my machine checked and retensioned and nothing works.
Oh, so it's the bottom fabric. So the fabric that's against the feed dogs that bunches up.
Mm-hmm.
That's strange. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to mull that over.
Yeah. Like the only thing I can think of is that if it's bunching, say, because the walking foot is not actually working, then the walking foot is putting pressure and holding that top fabric in place, and the feed dogs are working and bunching. So that could be it. So maybe a faulty not working. And I know you said you're pretty sure it's on correctly because it wouldn't be working otherwise, but there's that bar, right? And there's the needle bar on your machine, and there's like that little arm of I wish I had my walking foot right here, but the little arm of the walking foot that has to go over that bar. And if it doesn't, then it really is not going to work. It's going to sound like it's going to work. It's going to move up and down like it's working. But if that little claw arm of the walking foot isn't over the needle bar, then it's not going to work. So maybe double check that too. We're going to need to just do some more walking foot research.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, next question here. It says, beginner here. Thanks, Nikki. Didn't know I had to change my needle and use it and used it until it broke. I just bought a new universal and will take your advice. So perfect.
Good. I'm glad.
This is something that you and I go back and forth on because I know you are better about keeping track of sewing time and needle usage and changing your needle. And I wish my machine had like a check engine light that would just kind of tell me, because I kind of just go until there's a problem and then I know that's the first thing to check. So either you've talked about the flagging, listening to your machine, things like that. So you can,
or like a chess timer. You hit it when you start sewing, and then hit it when you're done, and then like an alarm.
Yep.
There's an invention.
I think so. Yeah. All these computerized machines, there should be a way to just add that in there too. Yeah.
I think.
All right. How do you use Best Press? I see people using it and I am confused on how to use it. Do you spray the whole piece of fabric and iron it before sewing? If I am piecing, should I spray it all before I cut the pieces or after I have made the cuts?
This is embarrassing, but I don't know what Best Press is.
So it's like a starching product. I'm going to call it that. A sizing kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I've never used it. If it doesn't have instructions on the back of the can, you could probably, how to use Best Press in your search bar and probably get other people's instructions. But personally, I have not used that, so I'm sorry I can't answer.
Have you ever? So I'm thinking of it from like, because she's talking about piecing, I'm thinking quilting. So like in prepping quilting fabric, I have never starched my fabric when I'm getting ready to do a quilt. But I've also never really starched a fabric when I'm sewing or making like a nice dress shirt either. So have you ever just used starch? And if so, do you have any just general blanket starch tips?
I have not used starch, but as I'm thinking about this, so if you're spraying pieces to like starch them, kind of stiffen them up, before you're sewing, I would think it would be easier and less messy to spray the whole piece before you cut them. Because if you cut them and you've got your little pieces for piecing, and then you go to spray them, you're going to have something behind it so that you're not spraying on your ironing board. I did that. It wasn't starch, but I was putting stabilizer on pieces for cutting out little appliques. And instead of like stabilizing each tiny little piece, I stabilized a whole chunk and then cut my applique pieces out of that. And it was just easier and faster. So that would be my initial thought. But again, I have not ever used Best Press, so take that with a grain of salt.
Perfect. All right, next question here. Constance says, I really want to use organza, but I have such trouble sewing it. So any tips?
Yes. So organza is a very thin, lightweight, sheer fabric that can be super tricky to sew. So what I like to do if I'm sewing something that is, kind of flimsy, lightweight, an all-purpose needle is probably fine. But since I have microtex needles that I have inherited from all of my grandmas, they were all sewers, so I've got an incredible stash. I have microtex needles, so I just throw those on when I'm using something that is, lightweight, sheer, kind of delicate. Because the microtex needle has just a super fine, sharp point, and use a small, thin gauge so that you don't create holes in the fabric as you're sewing your seam. A lightweight thread is good for that. So some threads, they say on them lightweight, which is, just a good thin thread. So it doesn't weigh it down, and it'll lay on the fabric nicely. So you're going to laugh at me again, but to stabilize the fabric as it's going under the presser foot, the organza is so thin and fine, it can get shoved down into the throat plate, or just you'll have tension issues because it's like sewing air. It's so thin. So to stabilize that fabric, just put a layer of tissue paper under the fabric and just sew right over the tissue paper and then tear it off afterward. And that, just the weight of that tissue paper gives the mechanisms of your sewing machine, your needle and your thread, enough to grab onto to feed through as it's, normally supposed to do. I just went through all of the tissue paper in my house because I use it so much for sewing. So save that tissue paper from your gift bags or extra scraps from when you're cutting out those tissue paper commercial patterns, and just use them for that little bit of stabilizer. Even if you're sewing a zigzag stitch, I use stabilizer under that, and you can just tear it away from that stitch. And it beefs up that fabric. It stabilizes that fabric enough so that the needle doesn't, pull it out of whack, especially if you're using a zigzag stitch, so that it just stabilizes it just enough to, let that thread lay down a good stitch. So
Yes. Yep. I mean, over the years, I know we have talked a lot about tissue paper, and I've made fun of you about tissue paper for years, but I do have, remember, the autographed piece of Nikki LaFoyle tissue paper. So if I ever am going to stabilize something, I'll use that one, for commemorative reasons. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, I will. I still haven't used it, but it's in my sewing box. All right, one of these days. All right, we have time for one last question here. When sewing with knits, is it important to use a ballpoint needle?
I always do, and it's just general wisdom because a ballpoint needle is constructed for that specific use. A ballpoint needle is the tip is slightly more rounded than a universal needle. It's still sharp. You'll still draw blood if you poke yourself with it, but it's just more gentle on your knit fabric. Instead of slicing through the fibers as the needle's going through the fabric, it kind of nestles in between that, interlocked construction of that knit fabric. And it prolongs the life of the fabric, prevents runs in the long term, and it's just easier on your fabric. So you can definitely sew knits with an all-purpose needle. It has been done, and people are like, yeah, you can totally do it. It's fine. I did it and it was fine, and it will probably be fine. But if you encounter tension issues, that can be part of the reason. That can be one of the culprits, or add to the problem. And if you're sewing something out of that knit fabric that's going to get a lot of wear and a lot of washing, like a kid's shirt, or a mom shirt. I'm a mom, and anything that I sew for myself gets washed a lot. So anything that's going to get a lot of wear, you just want that fabric to have the best chance of surviving, and a ballpoint needle will do that for knits. And also, similar to the ballpoint needle is the stretch needle. It is designed specifically for super duper stretchy fabrics like spandex. What else? The ballpoint, the jersey needle, designed for jersey knit fabrics. So those three needles are manufactured, designed for use on knit fabrics. So I would highly recommend getting some of those in some different sizes, because a thinner needle is good for a thinner fabric, and a bigger needle, bigger gauge needle is good for if you're sewing some thicker knits that need a little bit more, to get through.
Yeah. Absolutely. And of course, it's always just a good idea to have one of every possible needle anyway.
Yeah.
You never know what you're going to run across. So grab some all-purpose, grab some different sizes of all the different types. And you can even sometimes find, again, I say value packed. Yep. You can find ones that have, one of every kind of needle in them. So always have, everything you need in your sewing room at all times. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here to answer everyone's sewing questions. Again, I want to remind everyone that we have a free download if you didn't already catch that. It is our Sewing from the Comfort of the Home calendar. So it's the banner either above or below your video, and just a fun sort of calendar to get you motivated to start a new project or to wrap up one that you have been putting off. So download that and try it out, and then join us back here next month, and Nikki will be back to answer more of your sewing questions. So thank you.
Thank you.